a lot of adopters, but they don't want to release their names. We're trying to persuade them, say they don't, because the majority contributor, about 40% contributed by Huawei. So, but they said, okay, we don't want to, get a connection for now under this environment. So that's give us a little bit trouble because the TOC member will, survey all the adopters to make sure is what's the feedback or something. So that's one thing. But we got about 4 or 5. They agreed to release their names. So far so good. So hopefully that will be open to public comments in a week or so. So currently under secret review.
Well, my vote, I think, doesn't count. Only the TOC members are authoritative, but I'd vote for it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, but once it's open to public comment, everybody can comment.
Yeah, you can make it. Typically, they have like some email thread, and people can do these so-called non-binding votes, but I don't really think they count for that much. But I guess it doesn't hurt just to show support.
But something, right? You can see in the K3S, the discussion, even Joe Beda and who's the other guy from VWorks. They are, strongly against that K3. That's why the K3S doesn't make the sandbox. So it still depends on who give the feedback, right? If the guy who have the influence on the public, that we decided. And yeah, and they changed the standard for sandbox. I guess more and more project can make a sandbox much easier. I wonder.
Well, give me a reminder when it comes up, and even though I don't have a binding vote, I'll slip in a vote with my name if you think it helps.
I will put in the stack when it's opening. Thank you.
Same here.
And yeah, there'll be more and more sandbox project in the CNCF, and I heard that they're going to lose the maintenance track for all the sandbox projects because they are going to, lose the standard for sandbox. They want more projects, but they are.
Yeah, I think that I've heard definitely some debate that they made the sandbox too loose. Particularly, that was the opinion in the storage SIG, but then it came down to an argument that once we let the first few in, we can't suddenly slam the gate shut on the others who look just as good as the ones we already let in. So,
but they are going to tighten up on the incubation and the graduation. Yeah, I'm hosting another the CNI Genie project. We applied last October. It never got processed. We stopped to the project is almost idle for about of 3 or 4 months, but suddenly it making the sandbox is surprising.
I haven't heard of that one. What was it again?
It's called CNI Genie. It's a more like a CNI improvement project. Let me post that one.
How does it? Why did you do it compared to just using stuff that's already out there? Like what's different about it?
Just one moment. Just 1 second.
If you want to join us, we've got a CNI called Antria that we're trying to get contributors for.
Actually, I'm not using that. So it's just helping that project. So it's kind of awkward for us if we want to maintain the project because it's
okay. I saw the link. Let me open that and take a look.
So you can see between October to May, there's no activities. Now it goes into the
yeah, the CNI becomes it's not just the issue of getting it in Sandbox, but even getting users, because having
too many.
when I'm doing Antria, there's, I believe, 37 CNIs now. And there's just a lot. I mean, if I think it has to have some key significant differences between, compared to what's already out there to make any sense.
Yeah, this one is more like a proxy to hook you up to multiple CNI plugins. So usually you only have one single CNI plugin, right?
Okay, yeah, I see the diagram. So it's a facade.
It's just say
And why
transparent.
would you want to hook up to multiple plugins?
The orange at the very beginning, some production team asked us, so we did that, and also Orange, the technical company, interested in that. However, I haven't followed them up, so I don't know what's going on right now. So I haven't touched it for almost a year.
Mm-hmm.
At the beginning, it's a more complicated environment. There's multiple deployment there.
Especially if it sits in the data plane where it's subject to causing latency, or if it's control plane only, fine. But it seems like if it's in the data plane, it can't improve performance, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could probably centralize monitoring and add monitoring to CNIs that don't have a really good monitoring story.
No, I just now it's awkward. I don't know who's going to maintain this project.
Yeah.
And
well, ultimately, maybe it's the users.
Yeah,
that's what usually happens to the graveyard of open source, right?
Yep. But you can see the VMware in the VMware archive. The org. There's a lot of archived open source project. Whenever not active, they put over there.
Okay, well, maybe I'll look at it for comparison later.
Yeah,
just because, like I say, I'm
user case, right? It's just answer your question. Who's going to use it? Why we use it?
Yeah.
I have a quick question about Cube Edge itself. I've just been scrolling through the document you sent around. And on the high-level architecture, you show connectivity to OPC UA, but I can't really find that in the documentation. Is that already implemented, or is this like on the roadmap?
This should be on the roadmap. I think it's the documentation. Which are you in the redoc that documentation, or?
Yeah, the docs.kubeedge.io, and then I just kind of hammered OPC UA in there.
Well, I'm looking at a diagram that shows it going through Mosquito.
Yeah,
and then that would seem like you could get to anything that hooks up to MQTT, right?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how it works on the OPC UA level, that you can just, if you can just hook it into MQTT. You probably can, because it's just JSON that comes out of it, but that actually sounds quite interesting. Another question that I thought about was, can I actually change device software with Cube Edge? So can I use containerized hardware controllers with Cube Edge, or do I have to use the MQTT broker?
So your question is the application running on the device, if it's a container or?
Exactly. So for example, my OPC UA server, or my Modbus server, or my Bluetooth device is actually a container that I want to change. Would that be possible, or do I? Yeah, because right now I'm actually like in the process of actually thinking about how to handle device communication with containers, setting up drivers, deleting driver when the drivers when the container is finished, and so on, and how to detect different hardware parts dynamically. So, for example, the ideal use case would be I have some kind of NUC or Raspberry Pi running somewhere, and then I just plug in some kind of USB device, and then some kind of daemon set detects what kind of USB camera this is, and then it installs the software on its own, or the drivers for that on its own on the host itself. And I'm actually not quite sure how to handle that.
No, yeah, it seems it's more like a plug and play, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't think we developed that. We are, I mean, the current in this year we are looking for the OTA update and firmware update, but that one is interesting. I never thought about that. I mean,
yeah, there actually is a downside. You know, like Windows has that plug and play, but potentially with an Edge IoT device that is unsecure, you know, like there's nobody, no security guards locking it down. It seems like there's a real vector for an attack there if you were able to plug in some random USB device and just get it to do things.
Of course. The idea I had was that you have some kind of daemon set running that has like an allow list in its let's say search pattern. So you kind of check boxes like I want to support this and this and this kind of hardware. I have no idea how you can actually check for that. Like, of course, USB devices and stuff like that is quite easy, but as soon as you go like, I don't know, GPIOs or SPI interfaces and stuff like that, it gets really nasty detecting what is actually plugged in there. So I'm not quite sure how to handle that on the detection level, but the idea sounds or was quite nice that you kind of just grab whatever you have in your let's say in your closet, and then you just plug it into your computer and it gets the software automatically and you don't have to worry about installing it. Yeah, so that was like and then I thought about like how can I handle that with initialization pods, for example, handling the installation on the host. How can I delete the driver afterwards once I kind of get rid of it, or like when I unplug the USB device and stuff like that. But I'm not quite sure how to handle that right now. And I just thought about throwing it in here if you guys have any ideas. Like
yeah, I got a question for you before I throw out ideas, but are you using the OPC UA right now? And if so, it's been years since I had anything to do with OPC, but at one time that used to be Windows only. Just curious if that is fully supportive of Linux these days.
I'm not quite sure, actually. So I have the feeling that the big PLC manufacturers like Siemens and so on are pretty much pushing the whole protocol right now. I think it can be run on Linux. I have to admit I'm not quite a big fan of OPC UA, because it's like the idea of microservices brought down to the production or to the manufacturing level, but in a very complicated matter. You know what I mean? Like the whole protocol, I think 1,800 pages, and I've never actually seen somebody completely implementing that.
Well, I think it owned the space in the 90s. And
But
because of that, there's lots of drivers.
That was the
right now,
OPCDA.
I don't really see like why can't I use something similar like gRPC or the simple JSON and some kind of IDing or like OpenID with JSON and REST for authentication. But of course, I know that they want to do like the whole semantic server thingy. Like I just plug in my OPC UA server into my network, and then it kind of introduces itself into the network and says, hey guys, I have this kind of function and I have this kind of data that you can query and so on. But personally, I believe it's like a very complicated protocol for just doing that. And yeah, so I'm not the biggest fan. I'm not quite sure how it will evolve. Yeah.
So just one note, Steve, that thing that you were saying that's Microsoft only, that was OPCDA, I think.
Yeah, I think it was the first generation OPC.
First generation, yeah.
Was based on, natively, it was actually driven by
DCOM,
old Windows DDE, would talk about ancient protocols.
Yeah.
And it was definitely Windows only.
But now the OPC UA is a proper standard. Yeah. But as Moritz says, I think it's too complex and in my opinion too like a client server oriented architecture for the modern world. But
yeah, well, it was old school even in the sense this might have changed too, but you actually had to join the foundation to even see the API and pay the money to, it was not what I would call open in the traditional sense.
If you want to download the whole specification, you have to be a member. And depending on the size of your company, right now it's up to I think $1,000 per year.
Yeah, and they had so many meetings before that effectively. See, I did a startup called Wonderware that we literally invented that DDE protocol. And at one time, I think I probably had written, this was the very first few years, but I personally had written over 50% of those OPC drivers. And, it was a scenario where it was complex enough that companies in the field probably devoted at least one full-time employee to just keeping up with OPC.
Yeah, I think like the problem right now is that OPC UA is like this digitalization for manufacturing protocol, or it's called like that. Let's say it like that. And what it basically does, it's enforcing people to not think about networking, which I find like really hard if you really want to digitalize your manufacturing process, because you can't do like digitalization without knowing all the network stuff underneath. You know what I mean?
Right.
So for me, it's kind of like this, oh yeah, we can pretty much do everything you want in this protocol because we have service discovery and we have reflection and we have everything you want. You have to pay a lot of money for that. And it's so complicated that only very specialized people can actually do that.
Yeah. One of the other aspects in that field is that the end users, once they find something that works, are very resistant to swapping it out. So if they're convinced that this OPC driver is at least stable and bug-free, they don't want to take the perceived risk of switching to something different, because you've got people who, a factory outage could cost them $1 million, and if it was something like a refinery, the whole plant could explode or something. So they're kind of risk averse.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I think that's the whole discussion, like the whole discussion about agility in manufacturing, for example, because I've talked to people from Siemens, for example, and they still serve customers from 20 years ago with PLC repair parts that were built like in the 80s, basically, which is crazy if you think about that.
Well, a lot of that is even the wiring costs. When you put these into something like a chemical plant, they're essentially welded into the facility and sealed up when they're first installed. And they're not easy to change. Some of them are even using these microamp of current intrinsic safety protocols. And when I was in that field in the 90s, there were people still running pneumatic control systems, believe it or not, that had been put in the 50s. So the stuff was, at that time, 40 years old.
It probably didn't change till now, right?
I don't think it probably wasn't going to change until they tore the whole plant down and built a new one.
Yeah.
What they do is they put gateway interfaces and then keep using the ancient stuff.
The funny part is that the whole industry, for example, like the automotive industry, now wants to become more agile or more flexible in their production system. And of course, the whole hardware they have been building for the last 20 to 30 years is not prepared for that, because you can't just plug and play your, I don't know, your press for your car. I don't know, what is it called in English? Or for your engine. For example, the drilling machines or whatever. Of course, the question arises, like, how flexible do you want to go? Like when you think about what you just said, chemical plants, where the adaptability doesn't need to be that big. You can argue, okay, I can just weld my software and my hardware in there. But of course, as soon as you want to change something later on, that gets like really hard to do. And I kind of feel like a lot of people are trying to be more flexible in that way by using old hardware, and that's definitely not going to work.
Yeah. I don't know. My attitude is that the hardware in those things probably isn't going to change, and I'd learn to live with it. But the key to flexibility in my mind is your APIs are your key to having long life, non-disruptive. And I'd use as a model something like, if you look at the internet, you've got these ancient protocols like Border Gateway Protocol, for example, which handles the routing and switching between internet carriers. And that stuff is literally decades old. Yet, I don't know of anybody even talking about changing it. And the reason it has lasted is simply that it was extensible, and they did a decent architecture so that has been able to evolve over time, even when the time period is decades. You know, the LLDP, the link layer discovery protocol, is another one like that just was really well done. And I actually think the Kubernetes control plane, particularly with the CRD feature that, really got expanded out a couple years ago, gives Kubernetes the opportunity to put an abstraction on things so that, I'm happy to live with and not rip and replace the old stuff. For many customers or users, that's going to be a feature. But the key is whether new things can come along that you didn't anticipate today, and will you be able to fit them in? So the bigger story, I think, is being able to accommodate the new stuff. But when you think about it, if you can accommodate a new thing that you didn't even conceive of when you did an API, more than likely you can also fit in some ancient thing that is, 40-year-old technology. You might have to put some kind of wrapper gateway around it, but you should be able to fit it in and manage it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I really like the design of the Kubernetes API, because it just you kind of feel that the people put so much work in at it to make it like plug in, or to use plug-in architectures on every level. Like, for example, network plugins and container plugins, or CNI plugins. So basically everything is changeable in case you want to.
Yeah,
If you
storage
have to,
as well. And then on top of that, if you have to manage some new category of thing, even if it's only a problem unique to you,
yeah,
you can write your own CRD and controller and manage to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, just to let you know, I think it's because of the last time I used the master account for the working group. You're showing my headshot on the little icon for participants. So I think if you right mouse click, you can replace it with your own or set it to blank. It just looks funny because I'm looking at two of me on there now.
Don't you have a twin?
No, I do have a brother, but he's not a twin.
Okay.
He's the better looking one.
Yeah, I'm still not quite sure if actually managing devices or device software with Kubernetes is a good idea. Like,
well, I don't think we'll ever get it built into the official API, but I think that there's a potential for putting a facade on there that could manage common devices and have them be a viable open source project, if you will. I don't think that the Kubernetes steering committee at this time would accept it as part of Kubernetes itself. It's just like technically right now that the CSI storage plugins are not part of Kubernetes. They're considered outside.
Like, don't they want to like burden the main developers with the task, or?
Well, part of it is just that they want to have independent release cycles. So part of taking storage out of tree is that Kubernetes releases every quarter. And for some forms of things you'd link in, that's too rapid. And for other purposes, it's too slow. Like, you know, just like right now, there's 35 plus CNIs. There's probably way more than that in storage drivers. And suppose a security bug is found in one of those. You don't want to have to re-release the whole of Kubernetes to do a security patch on one IO driver. But when those things were in tree, that's exactly what you had to do. So part of this isn't just for flexible replacement, but it's also to avoid Kubernetes being a gigantic monolith that has to be, you know, that becomes a huge release and test effort that bogs down the ability to update these little pieces independently.
Okay. So basically, Kubernetes is a microservice-based architecture itself.
In a way, or at least it has plugins. But I think the other cool thing is that you don't, if, you know, the main categories now are container runtime, networking, the network plugin, and storage plugins. But let's just say, I don't know, you wanted to do industrial temperature controllers. Kubernetes itself is never going to do that because it's too much of a niche use case. But nothing would stop you if you could get critical mass, like if you could get all the manufacturers of temperature loop controllers or PLCs, which you brought up, to get behind a standard and, you know, unify on one CRD to rule them all. I think you could pull that off. Now, some of those device categories like PLCs are so different, I don't know that you could ever do it. But others, like I think the loop controllers actually are standard enough that you probably could do it if you could get everybody in the industry behind it.
Yeah.
You know, the PLC programming models just between, I don't know, what's used by Siemens and what's used by the US based PLCs is just kind of fundamentally different in concept. And I think I haven't been in the field for 10 years, but it was just from day one perpetual sniping at each other over which was the better method. And I don't think I'd ever expect them to agree to one thing.
Yeah, I always have like the feeling that it's more like an Apple versus Android thing, you know?
Yeah.
Like, what do you actually do? Like you just write some structured text or some letter programs and then it runs in loops forever. And both or most vendors pretty much have all the parts you need, and you kind of just get stuck in this religious war between vendors.
Right. And then once your customers go down the path of having all their staff learn your terminology and learn your programming tools, they'll never want to change.
Yeah, of course. And this stuff is really complicated, like more complicated than it should be. Yeah, like Kubernetes is a blast compared to setting up an PLC. Like,
I don't know. It just depends. If you take somebody like in the US market, somebody like an electrician rather than a software engineer, they kind of like the way the things are laid out for them because that was the engineering effort to make it digestible from people who in the day maybe even connected up old physical relays. And, you know, those people, I think, who have never been to a computer science program would have great difficulty absorbing Kubernetes.
yeah, the concept is quite abstract, I think. Funny.
The interesting one where you see, I think maybe really ripe for new adopters and new ways of doing things are home automation, just where you certainly are talking about people who don't have an IT background, don't have an engineering background, yet are just trying to get their light switches and things to work as in a way they want. And there are a lot of novel approaches to doing home automation that look kind of fascinating. And it is one of these where no vendor seems to agree on it, at least at the current time.
Yeah. I've just found out like the whole, what was it, Home Assistant, I think, this open source project, this can actually be run on Kubernetes, which is actually quite fun.
Well, maybe you weren't there, but I demoed it. I've been playing around with that one myself.
Oh, cool.
So it's actually, I came to the conclusion that I didn't want to run the IO part on Kubernetes though. So I ended up doing, I chose Z-Wave, but regardless of what you chose to interface to your IO, like your light switches and sensors, you could use Zigbee or Z-Wave, or there's probably, at least in the US market, a couple of other plausible things. Yeah. But I chose to have those route to a Raspberry Pi, which then publishes it MQTT using a Mosquito broker. And then the Home Assistant talks to the Mosquito broker to do its IO. And I like that model just because Home Assistant takes patches like at least once a week. And by the time you bundle in the Z-Wave thing and everything else, you're probably getting hit with a patch once a day. And it was just too disruptive. And being able to separate it out just seemed like a better model, where I keep kind of a stable core of just my light switches on a Pi. And then anything user interface and things like that, I can totally take them off the air non-disruptively, and the physical light switches in my house continue to work.
Which is quite nice.
I'm not sure, part of the reason I ran Home Assistant on Kubernetes is just that I'm really familiar with Kubernetes and keep a cluster running in my house. But if I was to recommend a home automation system to my mom, I would not be recommending running it on Kubernetes. She isn't up to the task of keeping a Kubernetes cluster running. And I'm the one who'd get the late night calls that it wasn't working.
Yeah, I had a similar situation, I think 3 weeks ago with my dad, who tried to install Nextcloud on a server. And I was just like really frustrated with the whole deployment process, because you have to set up Nginx and you have to set up some kind of certificate in Nginx, and then you have to port forward the whole thing. And I was just like, wow, if we just would like pull up a cluster right now and then put Let's Encrypt on there, we would be done in like 5 minutes. But we're doing it by hand. This is like pain.
Yeah. Well, even Kubernetes has that stuff going on. If you're talking about running it on-prem, like in your house, you're going to need ingress, and that might quite likely end up being Nginx. So there's a lot of moving parts. Some distros will configure all that stuff for you pretty easily, but if you do it the hard way from the pure open source, there's a fair amount of work getting that up.
Yeah, but I have it like running at my home with like MetalLB and Nginx ingress. And the nice part about that is that everything is like very easy deployed. It's not like for example Nginx, where you have like just the bare bones once you install it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, it's easy to deploy for you probably, but the average.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'm at the point right now where I would rather like install a whole new cluster with all the moving parts instead of like doing it the old way, which is quite funny.
But yeah, if you look at Home Assistant,
you cross the chasm, yeah.
Even when you run it on a Pi, they don't really document it well. You have to go over to the developer docs to see how this works. And then I SSH'd into my Pi and started poking around. And they're running all the components in Docker containers, even on a Pi. And there's no orchestrator there. So they're just set up to run at the Pi's boot time with the main Home Assistant in one container. If you're using Z-Wave, that's running in another one. And if you go the Z-Wave route with Home Assistant, they fire up this Open Z-Wave in a container. They fire up Mosquito in a container, and they fire up Home Assistant in a third. So they're set up as containerized microservices talking across the Docker container boundaries. No Kubernetes at all. It's just hand wired together.
Yeah. Do you know the Kubernetes support on Raspberry Pis right now? I mean, they had...
My opinion is I have not had good luck on it. So, you know, we had the speaker from Microcates come to our meeting, in January, and it does work. I mean, it's actually Microcates. You can install it on a Pi and have kubectl talking to it in an hour. And it's pretty straightforward, but I found it wasn't that stable. And the other trouble is that in a Pi's memory footprint, by the time you lay down Kubernetes, you don't have that much left over for apps. So I think if you wanted to do it, there is an argument for just going down to a bare bones Docker container runtime and not putting the orchestrator on top of it. I think, you know, one of my thoughts are when you get as low as a Pi, and if you're only going to run one Pi, a lot of what you've got going on in Kubernetes is management of a cluster that anticipates multiple worker nodes. And if you don't have multiple worker nodes, is the cost of installing all these components that you're not effectively going to call upon actually worth it in terms of complexity and CPU and memory consumption? You know, if you are only single node, maybe a better approach, even if you wanted to use a Kubernetes control plane, is to go down to a container runtime and have your Kubernetes control plane external and use CRDs to control the containerized workloads, of which there may only be one or two.
Yeah. What I think is nice is that the whole deployment process becomes unified. So it doesn't really matter where you are at, but you deploy everything with the same steps, basically.
Yeah. Because when you think about it, even if you had multiple clusters, more than likely IO devices are locked to one cluster node. You know, there's a lot of this device IoT stuff that isn't really on a bus that could talk to 3 different Kubernetes nodes so that you were free to schedule the gateway talking to that to any one of 3 nodes non-deterministically. And if you're IO, like you have one USB Z-Wave interface, the gateway is going to have to run on the node that thing is plugged into. And if you're going to have to get the Kubernetes scheduler to always deploy it on that one node, it's sort of like you're fighting the scheduler with a bunch of labeling and things to get that to happen rather than having it be your friend.
Yeah, true.
But I don't know, what do you think of that again? I mean, Kube Edge is dealing with a lot of those things, I think, for applications involving device edge. So,
but even if you have a specialized operator, you still have a unified deployment model, right? So you install it and it will take care of the application, right?
Yeah, even a lot of the things that really go on with a deployment, like a container image registry, technically are independent of Kubernetes itself, right? I mean, when you get down to it, the container runtime is going to pull the image from an image registry, not from Kubernetes itself.
Ian, were you to say something?
No. It's okay.
So I think one of the areas that isn't covered is actually some kind of, Kubernetes manages like a control plane and deploying containerized images. It is less than standardized for doing things like firmware images out to devices, like you wanted to replace the firmware on whatever device. It's something you probably need to have managed. And you certainly could do it in Kubernetes with CRDs, but it isn't architected in. The other thing
host updates with Kubernetes nodes right now?
Well, to some extent, if you're in a public cloud provider, there's something called Cluster API where you can deploy or replace hosts. But if you're out on-prem on bare metal, let's just say you're running on a server, I don't know, a Dell or an HP server, those things have a lot of firmware. And in the course of a year, it's more than likely the BIOS and maybe firmware on host bus adapters need patches, some of them security related, but there's nothing now in Kubernetes that's going to handle that for you.
Yeah, because this is quite similar to the question I had earlier, like how do I handle device drivers for example, USB cameras, like that. Like how do you handle firmware on device level?
Yeah, well, security cameras are a common one that often get security patches, right? So it would make sense that for the edge use case, you would want some standard thing. I don't know that it'll ever be written into Kubernetes, but I think you could do it with a well-architected CRD of some kind.
Yeah.
So I think Yen, when he was talking about KubeEdge, didn't you say something about wanting to take on the mission of doing firmware updates or management?
Yeah, but for the OTA, we are looking for some other solutions. As I mentioned, I remember probably 2 weeks ago or a month ago in this meeting, Qten also mentioned probably the Hobbit. I mean, young,
Yep.
yeah, that's a possible solution. I don't think Kubernetes itself will do that, but it can integrate with other open source projects to solve the problem.
So if you were to use Hawkbit along with Kubernetes, has anybody done like a CRD for Hawkbit that plugs into Kubernetes?
Not that I am aware of, and what I think Kilton and the guys from Bosch are doing is they're trying to model the gateways and the physical resources, not with the CRDs, but with Vorto, Eclipse Vorto, which is a kind of a modeling language used for the devices.
It's Eclipse what?
Vorto.
Could you spell it or put it in chat?
Yeah, I'll put it in chat. Let me see. Give me just a second.
Oh, Vorto,
so,
okay.
Yeah. So it's a modeling tool for different kind of payloads, like how do you define the payload of your sensor? So what's the temperature, what's the unit, what's the, like, how do you parse the data coming from the sensors? So they got to the idea to use the similar tool to basically model the edge nodes, so to say. So that and the Hawkbit uses or can use Vorto, so it would be possible then to apply this model and then basically say update the firmware or OS or whatever. I'm not sure. I haven't been involved into that directly, so I'm not sure how far they are in this. But it'd be good to have an update from them when they're ready. But I'm sure that the similar thing could be done with the CRDs as well, because yeah.
Yeah, I sat in on a presentation today in that open source summit on this Fledge project that was attempting to standardize a wrapper, if I understood it properly, around publishing data. And it looked pretty interesting. So I'm meaning to go dig into that and try to learn it.
What's the name?
Fledge.
Fledge, okay.
Here, I'll put it in chat. I wonder if we could recruit people from these two projects like Fledge or Vorto. The guy talking about Fledge today was actually a pretty good speaker. Maybe we can get him to come into one of our sessions and give a talk on it, and
sure,
Vorto as well.
It looks like, I mean, it's also in the whole Vorto thing. Like he's quoted on there, so maybe we ask him.
Sorry, didn't get it.
Preston Holmes is also on the Eclipse Vorto page. I think he's quoted down there. So he might have some contacts.
Yeah. He hasn't been here lately because, as I understand it, he has a different role within Google and isn't working in the Edge IoT space anymore, but we could still ask him.
Yeah.
And I can certainly reach out to the Bosch folks who are the main contributors behind the Vorto to talk about this. So yeah, let me see if I can do something for the next meeting maybe.
And by the way, speaking of meetings, we're I guess a little over time, but we started late. But I think we will be able to do a maintainer track session for the Boston online conference. So if anybody's got ideas for what we might want to cover there. We don't have to resolve it today, but I think technically they haven't even sent out the invites yet, but I expect that that will happen within a couple weeks.
Do you know where is the deadline?
No, it didn't even open for submits yet. So,
okay.
So usually they do the deadline after, and some of these they've stretched. I think some of these conferences, they seem to have, based on the extensions, they seem to be getting maybe issues with people not submitting talks. I think Open Source Summit Japan has been extended like 3 times now. And I don't think they do that unless they were having trouble getting speakers.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think this was useful. Now I'm curious about Vorto, so I'm going to go look at it and
Same.
and then I got just a teaser in Open Source Summit on Fledge, so I'm taking that as a homework assignment. And then keep us up to date on Cube Edge too. Like I say, if you're trying to get that graduated, I think
Sure, of course.
The people in this group are fans.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
It's 11:05 or my time anyway. Anybody else got any last minute topics, or maybe we can close this out?
I'm done.
Okay. Okay. Good night or good morning, whatever it is, wherever you are.
Going to work now.
See you around.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.